The morning sun crept through the cracks of Daniel's small apartment, casting pale stripes across the worn wooden floor. The hum of a city too busy to notice him filtered through the window. Daniel knelt beside two sleeping girls, their tiny hands curled around a threadbare teddy bear. In that quiet, he whispered a silent promise that, no matter how hard life became, he would never let them feel alone. His world was small, but full, stitched together with love and exhaustion. As he packed school lunches and slipped coins into an empty jar labeled dreams, he didn't yet know how close his path was to colliding with a woman whose life was its mirror opposite, overflowing with wealth, yet starved of meaning. Victoria Hale stared out from the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse. High above the same city Daniel walked through. Her reflection shimmered across a skyline she owned pieces of, but couldn't feel part of. She had built empires, made headlines, and won battles that cost her more than money. Her staff moved quietly around her, afraid to break her stillness. Somewhere below, life pulsed with laughter and chaos. She had traded it for silence. Her morning was all precision. Black coffee, unread messages, and a schedule designed to protect her from feeling anything unexpected. But that morning, for no reason she could name, she felt the strange tug of an unseen connection. As if someone, somewhere, had whispered a promise of change. Daniel's workday began with the hiss of machinery and the smell of oil. The factory floor was a rhythm of motion, metallic, relentless, loud. He kept his head down, mind drifting to the girls' laughter. Between shifts, he stared at his phone, scrolling through family photos that reminded him what all this effort was for. When his boss barked about overtime, Daniel nodded, though exhaustion bit deep. Every hour meant another meal, another small victory. He didn't know that the same day, his name would cross Victoria Hale's desk. A simple job application buried under dozens of others, holding the power to twist both their lives into an unexpected story of love, redemption, and rediscovery. Oh, and Shay. Victoria reviewed stacks of applications that afternoon, her assistant murmuring about schedules and meetings. Her eyes glazed over until one line caught her attention. Single father seeking part-time maintenance position. Something about those words lingered. She couldn't explain why, but the image of a man fixing things while raising daughters alone felt oddly grounding. She marked the file against every instinct and requested an interview. Her assistant hesitated, surprised. This wasn't the kind of applicant who usually made it past her filter. But Victoria only said, sometimes, "It's not the resume that matters. It's the reason behind it." As night fell, Daniel sat by the window, the city's glow flickering against his tired face. Ella and Grace had fallen asleep beside him after a bedtime story. He thought about the job listing he'd applied for. Maintenance work at a company so large he didn't even know the owner's name. He didn't expect an answer. Yet, something in his chest felt different tonight. A quiet stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world still had room for miracles. Across town, Victoria stared at that same application under the low light of her desk lamp. Neither knew it yet, but their separate worlds had already begun to move toward collision. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Daniel stepped into a lobby that looked more like a museum than a workplace. Marble floors gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers, and his reflection followed him in every polished surface. He clutched a folded resume, thumb rubbing the crease as if it could erase his nerves. The receptionist smiled politely, but he caught the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The oil-stained hands, the discount store shoes. As he waited to be called, Daniel's heartbeat matched the tick of the wall clock. Somewhere above, Victoria Hale prepared for another meeting she didn't think would matter, But fate often hides behind ordinary doors. Victoria's voice was calm but cool when Daniel entered her office. She had expected someone different, maybe someone desperate or insincere. But this man's presence carried quiet strength. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady yet humble. When she asked why he wanted the position, his answer wasn't rehearsed. "Because my daughters think I can fix anything," he said with a faint smile, "and I want to keep proving them right." The words hit something deep within her, an echo of the life she'd traded for ambition. For the first time in years, her questions faltered. It wasn't business she saw before her. It was something real. After the interview, Daniel stepped out into the city air feeling lighter than when he'd entered. He didn't know if he'd said the right things, but for some reason it hadn't felt like an interview. It had felt like a conversation. Victoria watched him leave from her window, arms folded loosely, eyes following his figure as he disappeared into the crowd. There was a flicker of warmth she hadn't expected, a feeling too human to fit into her calendar. Later that night, she replayed his words in her mind. "My daughters think I can fix anything." And for reasons she couldn't explain, she smiled. Later that evening, Victoria hosted a formal dinner meeting with investors, but her attention drifted. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the luxurious dining room. Yet every sound felt hollow. She found herself glancing at her phone, scrolling to the staff list, stopping at one name: Daniel Brooks, applicant. The people around her spoke in numbers and forecasts, but she heard only the echo of his voice. In that moment, Victoria realized how tired she was of perfection. She longed for something unpolished, something alive. Something real enough to break through the silence her wealth had built. Daniel returned home to find Ella and Grace drawing at the kitchen table. Their laughter filled the apartment like sunlight, breaking through clouds. He told them he might have a new job, and their cheers echoed down the hallway. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering, "See? You can fix anything, Daddy." In that instant, the fatigue of the day melted away. He looked at their hopeful faces and realized that sometimes the smallest victories carried the weight of miracles. Across the city, Victoria sat alone in her penthouse, staring at a phone screen that glowed with an unread message. "You're hired." Daniel's first day at Hale Industries began before sunrise. He arrived early, his old truck parked between luxury sedans, the difference almost laughable. Inside, he moved quietly, tools in hand, checking fixtures and lights. The halls echoed with the hum of wealth, yet he treated every task with reverence. When Victoria passed him in the corridor, she offered a polite nod, distant, professional. But as she turned the corner, she glanced back once more, noticing the care with which he handled even a broken light bulb. It struck her as oddly beautiful. The dignity of someone who fixed what others ignored. At lunch, Daniel sat alone on the rooftop terrace reserved for executives, fixing a loose railing he'd noticed earlier. Victoria found him there by chance, coffee in hand, pausing when she saw the skyline reflected in his eyes. "You don't have to do that," she said lightly. "It's not on your list." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but it needed doing." She stayed longer than she planned, drawn to the calm in his voice. When he spoke about his daughters, how they found joy in small things, something inside her softened. For the first time in years, Victoria laughed. Not the polite kind, but the kind that made her feel alive. The days that followed unfolded with quiet rhythm. Daniel worked steadily, and Victoria began to notice how his presence changed the air in her building. He greeted every person by name, held doors open, and never once complained. Once she found him helping the janitor carry heavy supplies. She watched unseen from her office window, realizing how rarely she had seen such humility. Later that evening, she passed him in the lobby, and for the first time she smiled first. He returned it, and though it lasted only seconds, it lingered in her thoughts the rest of the night. That weekend, Victoria walked through the company garden, a place she rarely visited. She found Daniel kneeling by a broken fountain, sleeves damp, tools spread beside him. He looked up, smiling, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't know anyone still cared about this place," she said. "I figured it deserved another chance," he replied. She watched the water trickle to life again, the faint sound blending with rustling leaves. Something about the simplicity of it, the effort to restore beauty without recognition, unsettled her in the best way. For once, she didn't feel like the CEO. She felt human. That evening, Victoria found herself sitting in her office long after everyone had left. She replayed the day. The laughter, the fountain, the quiet sincerity in Daniel's eyes. She had built a fortress of success, yet somehow this man had found the cracks in its walls. Down the hall, Daniel was finishing his shift. As he left, he noticed her light still on and hesitated, then knocked gently. She looked up, surprised. "You should go home," he said softly. Even the strong need rest. For a moment, she didn't know if he was speaking about her or himself. But she smiled. And for once, she didn't feel alone. Victoria stood in her office early one morning, staring at a small painting that had hung there for years. A landscape she'd once loved but hadn't truly seen in a decade. It reminded her of something Daniel had said about fixing what others forgot. Impulsively, she called him in. When he arrived, she asked if he knew anyone who could help restore her private garden, neglected behind her mansion for years. He hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe I could give it a try," he said. She hadn't meant to invite him into her home, but something in his confidence, steady, unassuming, made her say yes. The first time Daniel stepped into Victoria's mansion, he felt like he'd walked into another world. Ceilings painted with gold leaf, marble floors cold beneath his boots. But what struck him wasn't the grandeur. It was the silence. No laughter, no signs of life. He followed her through echoing halls until they reached the back terrace. Overgrown vines crawled across cracked stone paths. "This used to be my favorite place," she said softly. He looked around, nodding. "Then, let's bring it back." And in that moment, their worlds so far apart found common ground in something simple: the will to restore. Days turned into weeks as Daniel tended the neglected garden. Each morning he arrived with his sleeves rolled, boots muddy, and a quiet hum on his lips. Sometimes he brought his daughters along, bright-eyed, curious, their laughter bouncing off the marble walls that had known only silence. Victoria watched from her balcony the first few times, pretending to work, but her eyes always wandered to them. Ella offered her a flower once, shyly saying, "You should keep it. It makes things prettier." Victoria took it, her throat tightening. Not from sentiment, but from the sudden realization of how much she had missed, being seen by innocent eyes. By late afternoon, the garden began to change. Color returned where gray once ruled. Victoria started joining them, at first to supervise, then to help. She wore gloves that didn't fit quite right, kneeling beside the children as they showed her how to plant bulbs. Daniel watched her laugh, genuinely, freely, as soil smudged her hands. It was the first time he'd seen her without the armor of perfection. For a moment, she wasn't the woman with empires. She was simply someone rediscovering joy. When their eyes met, the unspoken truth between them deepened. Not love yet, but something dangerously close. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Victoria invited them inside for lemonade. A gesture that felt foreign, almost fragile. The girls wandered through her immaculate living room, marveling at the chandeliers and piano. "Do you play?" Ella asked. Victoria hesitated, then sat down and pressed a single key. The note hung in the air like a memory. Daniel watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets, expression soft. When she looked up, their eyes met, two lives that had no business intertwining, and yet somehow already had. Outside, the last light of day shimmered across the garden. They'd revived together. A week later, the garden was nearly complete. A transformation of life and color in a place that had long been forgotten. Victoria stood near the newly built stone bench, watching Daniel as he worked, his back to her as he trimmed the edges of the path. She couldn't help but admire him, not just for his hands-on skill, but for the way he carried himself, humbly, but with a quiet pride. For the first time in her life, she questioned the walls she had built around herself. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you had more time?" she asked, stepping forward. Daniel paused, looking up from his work as she spoke. His expression softened, but there was an unspoken heaviness in his gaze. "Sometimes I wonder how things would be if I didn't have to work so much, or if I could give them more." He looked toward the house, where his daughters were playing. "But then I look at them, and I'm doing the best I can. That's all I can give." He turned to face her fully. "What about you, Victoria? Do you ever wonder what you're really missing?" Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly averted her gaze. The question hung in the air between them. Later that night, Victoria found herself alone in her penthouse, staring out at the city lights. The skyline she had once ruled now seemed distant, its coldness a stark contrast to the warmth she felt in her chest. She reached for her phone, finding Daniel's number. The urge to reach out felt almost foreign, but something in her heart wanted to ask, to hear his voice. She hesitated, then sent a simple message. "Would you like to join me for dinner tomorrow night?" She couldn't remember the last time she'd extended such an invitation. But then she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this uncertain about her own heart. Daniel's response was simple. "Sure. I'd like that." The next evening, he arrived at Victoria's penthouse, not sure what to expect. He was used to small spaces, dinner on the couch, and the company of his daughters. But tonight, something about the setting felt different. He entered through the grand doors and into a space that had always seemed untouchable. They sat together at her dining table, surrounded by food that looked more like art than a meal. They spoke about everything and nothing, but for the first time, the conversation wasn't about the business of life. It was about the heart. As dessert was served, Victoria leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching his face. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you take this job? You don't need it." Daniel hesitated, the question piercing straight to his heart. He shifted in his seat, his hands moving uncomfortably on the table. "I didn't take it for the job," he said slowly. "I took it because I saw you, and I thought, maybe I could help you find what you've been missing." She blinked, not sure what to say. His honesty startled her, and in that moment she realized how much she had been hiding behind her wealth. The next few days felt different, charged with an unspoken energy. Daniel continued his work in the garden, but now there were quiet moments where he and Victoria exchanged more than just pleasantries. One afternoon he found her standing by the fountain watching the water run. She didn't speak at first, just watched the ripples on the surface. "I've spent so much of my life trying to make things perfect," she said quietly, almost as if she was talking to herself. "But maybe I've missed the beauty in what's imperfect." Daniel stood beside her, his presence solid but gentle. "Sometimes the cracks let the light in," he said. She turned to him then, searching his face for something she couldn't name. The days grew warmer, and with each passing moment their conversations became more personal. One evening, as they worked together in the garden, Daniel shared a story about the challenges he faced raising his daughters alone. Victoria listened intently, her usual guardedness softened by his openness. "You're stronger than I could ever be," she said, her voice low. "I've spent so much time building my life around walls to protect myself. I forgot what it felt like to really live." Daniel stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "Living is messy," he said with a smile, "but it's also the only thing that makes sense." She smiled back, her heart a little lighter than before. One evening, after a long day of work, Victoria invited Daniel to join her for dinner at a local cafe. A simple place, with warm lights and the smell of fresh bread in the air. As they sat across from each other, their conversation veered from casual chatter to something deeper. "What do you want out of life, Daniel?" Victoria asked, her voice sincere. Daniel thought for a moment, then replied, "I want to make sure my daughters have everything they need, and I want them to grow up knowing that love, not things, is what matters most." Victoria looked at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't define. "And you?" he asked, his voice quiet. She paused, searching for the words. "I want to be seen," she said finally. "Really seen. Not just for the wealth or the titles, but for who I really am." A few days later, Victoria found herself at Daniel's apartment, a modest space that seemed so different from her penthouse. She'd never stepped foot in a place like this before, and as she looked around, she felt the weight of its simplicity. The small furniture, the homemade art on the walls, the clutter of everyday life. It was a world she had never known but now felt drawn to. Ella and Grace rushed in, excited to show her their drawings. "This one's for you," Ella said, handing her a crayon-drawn picture of flowers. "It's what you helped Daddy fix." Victoria took the drawing, her eyes welling up with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. "It's beautiful," she whispered, surprised by the tenderness in her voice. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Daniel and Victoria sat on the couch, talking long into the night. "I don't know how to fit this into my life," Victoria confessed. "Everything I've built has been about control, and now it feels like I'm letting it all go." Daniel took her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "It's not about control," he said quietly. "It's about trust." He paused, then added, "I trust you." The words hit her with the weight of everything she had been avoiding. The truth. That she had built walls around herself to protect against the very thing she needed most. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I want to try." The morning was crisp and clear, a perfect reflection of the changes unfolding. Victoria stood in her penthouse, gazing out at the city skyline, her thoughts lost in the distance. She had spent years building this life, a life of wealth, security, and solitude. But now, everything felt fragile. Daniel and his daughters had quietly, yet undeniably, woven themselves into the fabric of her existence. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of her carefully constructed world, but she knew she was no longer willing to live in a fortress. As she turned to leave, she found herself pulling on a simple jacket, as though preparing to step into a new life, one that wasn't about status or success, but something much deeper. Later that day, Daniel arrived at Victoria's penthouse. A soft knock at the door. When she opened it, he stood there, holding a simple bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said with a warm smile, his eyes filled with a quiet affection. She took them, surprised by the gesture. They didn't need grand gestures. What they shared now was far more meaningful, but she couldn't ignore the weight of what she had to say. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've spent so much of my life afraid of letting go of what I have, afraid of losing control." She took a deep breath, the words finally coming. "But I think I'm ready to let go. I want to be part of your world, with you and the girls." The following week, everything shifted. Victoria spent more time with Daniel and his daughters. She found herself laughing with Ella and Grace, watching them draw and play. Slowly, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. One that wasn't measured by wealth or accomplishment, but by the love and joy she felt in these simple moments. One afternoon, they all went to the park, and Victoria pushed Ella on the swing, her laughter filling the air. Daniel stood nearby, watching them, a proud smile on his face. As he approached her, he said softly, "This is what I've always wanted. for them to feel safe and loved. Victoria smiled back, her heart full. "And you," she whispered. "What about you?" One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Daniel's apartment, the cool breeze blowing through the trees, Victoria turned to him with a serious expression. "Daniel, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been holding back for so long, afraid that if I let myself feel too much, I would lose everything. But with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. I know I've hurt you by not being honest, but I want to be with you. And I want to be part of your life, truly." She paused, searching his eyes. "But I also need to know that you feel the same way." Daniel's smile was slow and warm. "I've never been more certain of anything," he said, taking her hand. "This is the life I want, with you and the girls. It's what matters most." As the days passed, Victoria and Daniel's relationship grew stronger, built on trust, honesty, and shared experiences. They moved in together, merging their worlds, his small, humble apartment and her vast penthouse, creating a home that reflected both of their lives. Ella and Grace quickly warmed to Victoria, and they began to call her Aunt Victoria, a title that made her heart swell. Daniel watched as she navigated the new life with grace and love, never asking for anything in return, simply giving. And for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was truly living.